You're good to go, Mike.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Barnett. I serve as Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's QUASI seminar. These seminars are designed to enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when studying topics relevant to corporate social innovation. As editors, reviewers, readers, writers, teachers, and practitioners, we know that too many studies focus on questions that only rehash and rename established ideas, and they may have no practical impact. It's our hope that by pointing out what's known on all sides of a debate in very pointed and direct ways that we can drive researchers to produce sharper advances in our theoretical and practical understanding of how to help business better serve society. Today, we debate the question, what is the meaning of life? April Fools. The real question is, does social media facilitate corporate misconduct? Answering in the affirmative, we have Brian Houston. Arguing against, we have Michael Eder. Clarifying the contingencies, it's Rhonda Rieger. And providing a practical perspective, we have Craig Carroll. As each of our presenters argue their positions, please stay muted and post any questions or comments in the chat box. The open discussion will occur after all of our presenters have spoken in the half hour or so that remains thereafter. So let's get the party started. Over to Brian.
Okay, thank you very much. So I can share my screen, right? Okay. So let's see, I need to let's see that.
Are you able to go full presentation?
That's what I'm working on.
You kicked it back up.
Do that first. Okay. Okay, so you should be looking at my presentation, right?
There it is. Yep.
Great. Okay. So, does social media facilitate corporate misconduct? Of course. I'm not sure how there could be any other conclusion. I think the issue is going to be when and how does social media facilitate corporate misconduct? And to answer that question, I'll be relying on a paper that Mike, Irene, and I wrote that was published in 2020 in the Academy of Management Perspectives on the rise and stall of stakeholder influence, how the digital age limits social control. So, we're at the beginning of this digital age. Before the digital age began, we talked a lot about stakeholders influencing firm behavior. A lot of work has been done on that question. We know a lot about when and how stakeholders used to influence firm behavior based on people like Jeff Fruman, Tim Raleigh, and many others. But these foundational studies are all pre-digital. And so what we are trying to do in this paper is to kind of update the concept of stakeholder influence in light of the changes that have taken place in the digital age. So the question is, how has stakeholder influence over firm behavior changed in the digital age? And many expected a drastic change. There was talk about there would be democratizing of control of information, that there'd be greater ease in sharing information, which would increase stakeholder influence, and that this digital age would empower stakeholders, and it would enable everybody, everyday people, to change the world. And so there was, it would underpin widespread change across society, including political rule. And so events like the Arab Spring were definitely facilitated by social media. So definitely it has had a big impact. But And in terms of people and what we do, it definitely has allowed us to pester firms publicly. A bad review or negative comment can be retweeted by millions, and companies are often keen to diffuse customer anger very quickly in a public space such as Twitter. According to a poll of 2,000 people by the communications agency Fishburne, Hedges, and Echo Research, in April 2012, 36% of people had used a social media platform to contact a big company, and 65% said it was a better way than call centers to get in touch with companies. So it's had a big impact. Everybody will remember this story about the passenger on a United Airlines flight. Apparently the flight was overbooked, and 4 people were asked to step off of the plane. 1 passenger refused, and so he was forcibly removed. It was videotaped and posted on social media, and the rest is history. And it had a huge impact on United and on their, the value of the stock. So clearly, social media does expose corporate wrongdoing. But what about all of these other things that have taken place? Oxfam in Haiti, Amtrak derailment. There are many, many, many issues that are mentioned on social media, but I just forgot. This is the Twitter outrage graph, which is kind of funny. So basically, you start along the time of day on your x-axis, and you look at the level of outrage. So it starts with waking up in the morning. Oh my God, have you heard about this thing? I am outraged. Everyone is outraged. I am more outraged than anyone. Oh my God, someone just tweeted a joke about it that's offensive, and I'm outraged. I'm now more outraged about the joke than I am about what was originally outraged about. Somebody should resign, not sure who. I'm arguing with a total stranger. It transpires that this story is much more complex than first meets the eye.
Let's even see.
Oh, X factor's on. So the outrage declines considerably. So is social media giving us too much of a good thing? In the age of technology, there's constant access to vast amounts of information. The basket overflows, people get overwhelmed. The eye of the storm is not so much what goes on in the world, it is the confusion of how to think, feel, digest, and react to what goes on. It makes it easier for activists to express themselves and harder for that expression to have any impact. Manipulating information has become a major industry. There's a lot of discussion about astroturfing. The term astroturf comes from the synthetic grass, designed to look like natural grass, but it is in fact fake grass, generally used for sports fields. Now it's applied to grassroots organizations financed by corporations. So you have Exxon financing Energy in Depth, which is a project of the Independent Petroleum Association of America, which studies fracking, and it studies climate change, but blames climate change on non-industrial, non-petroleum based causes. Americans for Technology Leadership, financed by Microsoft and others, basically is an organization that seeks to maintain very loose controls and regulations on internet.
In progress.
And there are many others, in every industry you can find these sorts of organizations, which are financed by corporations to push a specific policy agenda. So the question is, how and when do stakeholders influence firms in the digital age? And in the paper, we argue that stakeholder influence has actually stalled in the digital age. Even secondary stakeholders may now directly and cheaply voice concerns, but on average, individual stakeholders are not more likely to affect firm behavior. And in the aggregate, firms have retained, if not gained, discretion. So this is the model we developed that looks at the relationship between information disclosures and changes in firm behaviors. And so you go through information is disclosed, it comes to the stakeholder, but it has to be filtered by the stakeholder in order to come to a decision to act. And this filtering is affected by processes of sense-making on the part of the stakeholder and sense-giving, often by the corporations or these astroturf organizations. And once stakeholders decide to act, whether or not that results in changes in firm behaviors depends on the framing of the issue. And the effectiveness of that framing will depend on, stakeholder synchronicity, the ability of stakeholder evaluation, stakeholder messages to converge, and slacktivism, which is the idea that very often social media activism is not particularly effective. It's not something that most firms will need to worry about. So let's talk about each of those and explain a little bit what they are. Filtering, stakeholders first need a reason to act, and they'll act when their interests or identity are challenged. So the literature assumes stakeholder awareness of such issues as if stakeholders are presented with an issue. It's like, oh, okay, here is an issue that I need to be concerned with. But the problem is most problems don't come that way. So the stakeholder must notice and make sense of the issues before deciding to act on them. The stakeholder must discern a pattern, and after a while that pattern emerges, and the stakeholder can then see a particular issue. So stakeholders will filter out many issues before they can be acted upon. Simply, they may not notice the pattern or the issue, or they may misinterpret them. So in the digital age, we're as stakeholders are filtering under information overload. So when stakeholders or people are overwhelmed with information, it tends to narrow our field of vision. We rely on heuristics to simplify the interpretation of that information. We rely on what we already know and tend to seek information that confirms our prior beliefs. So this simplification and automaticity renders viewpoints more inertial. So despite access to more information, the likelihood of altering views decreases. And exposure to counter evidence can reinforce pre-existing positions. Now, in terms of the second kind of big arrow in our framework, framing, which connects the stakeholder decision to act to changes in firm behavior. To create change, issues must be framed in a way that will attract supporters. And it's harder to break one's established frame in the digital age, so it's even harder to gain supporters. So even when gaining supporters, many stakeholders, or at least social media users, substitute slacktivism for action. You get these token displays of concern by liking a specific message on Facebook or Twitter. And the other process that affects the ability of a framing to affect firm behavior is, we call it synchronicity. It's this idea of synchronizing efforts or enabling stakeholders' messages to converge in order to create change. It's very cheap to act, but amidst such easy communication, it's harder to hold a unified voice. And also, these users will face pushback from firms and government. Now, the the two processes that will affect the filtering process are sense making and sense giving. Much information is now filtered by infomediaries like Facebook and Google, which use algorithms that create these filter bubbles. And we're less likely to see information that is counter to one's interests or identity. So we're less likely to be challenged with respect to our particular ideas and perspectives. As a result, and firms have an easier time engaging in sense giving to provide a counter narrative. So they can pay for targeted access to info channels, and they can disguise themselves through this process of astroturfing that I mentioned. And as a result, these efforts combine to retard the efforts to change existing firm stakeholder relations. So the filtering that will affect the stakeholders' decision to act results in fewer decisions to actually act. So what I want to do now is to go back to each one of these processes and look at how they've changed from comparing before the digital age to after, to see the likelihood of seeing changes in firm behavior. So in terms of filtering, before the digital age, there was reliance on professional gatekeepers to curate across limited broad social media sources. Now, with the post-digital activity, unfiltered information flows across many narrow media sources. And the result is that personal biases shape stakeholder media diets that reinforce these biases. In terms of framing, before the digital age, power, especially for secondary stakeholders, was a function of the ability to frame an issue in ways that resonate. But now digital media have unleashed a torrent of personalized frames on issues. And as a result, these established frames are harder to break, which insulates firm stakeholder relationships from change. In terms of sense making, before social media, stakeholders interpreted information in relation to their economic interests and social identity. Now, with media fragmentation, selective exposure limit the likelihood of confronting interest and identity inconsistent information. And the result is that extremes of information exposure produce threat rigidity response or backlash, further reinforcing stakeholders' established views.
Brian, do you have a bunch more left, or is this last couple of slides?
I think I'm on 20 of 24.
Okay, you
Almost.
have to step it up just a little bit. You're out of time.
Okay, sorry, thanks. In terms of sense giving a similar, before the digital age, public relations efforts help firms to shape the narrative of managing crises. And now with social media and astroturfing, a lot of these firms can engage in counter movements covertly. Slacktivism, before the digital age, stakeholders who supported a movement would decide to free ride if the costs were too high. Now, supporting a movement falls to nearly zero. So the result is that these token displays of support basically don't have much of an impact on firms who can weather the social media storms. Synchronicity is the ability of these issues to come together, converge, and it used to be political organizations would generate commitment, coherence, and now it's nearly costless to mobilize. Many people can organize large movements through social media. And so the result is that the volume of customized efforts to act on various issues make coherence, unity of purpose, and persistence hard to achieve. So, I think this opens up just a whole panoply of all sorts of questions. Basically, main question is, under what conditions do stakeholder evaluations converge? So we've basically said that in the digital age, information flows freely and costlessly. Stakeholder influence would seem to increase as a result. But, accounting for these cognitive processes, we see that basically what we have is a cacophony that provides firms cover to maintain or even increase discretion. So stakeholder influence has stalled, not snowballed. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Brian. So yeah, everybody has a bullhorn now, and so it's pretty loud out there, and it's kind of hard to sort through it, and firms can take advantage of that. But let's go now over to Michael for a counter perspective.
You can see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, yeah. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's really great to be part of the series that Mike Barnett has organized since the start of the pandemic. So thanks for that, Mike. And also great to be in such great company. So as already mentioned, I'm Michael Etter, Associate Professor at King's College London. And I do research on digital media and social evaluation, such as corporate reputation, legitimacy, stigma, and also look at the corporate misconduct as events that are picked up and negotiated in social media and eventually impact social evaluations on a broader scale. I have the no position being given here, and at first I was a bit hesitant to accept this. Social media not facilitating misconduct after all these scandals with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, data breaches, manipulation, surveillance capitalism, misuse of user data, etc. So what is my line of argumentation here for no? So what I want to do, it builds probably a bit on Brian here, and I would like to counter some of his points as well in the spirit of a proper debate. And the way I want to argue is that social media help to make corporate misconduct more visible, can help companies, help holding companies accountable, sanction them, and thereby potentially prevent corporate misconduct. Also because organizations might change towards the better, hopefully. This is also a bit hope that comes in here. And to make this argument, I have 3 points, and I actually going to stick to the instructions by Mike to 5 slides. I'm not sure if Brian gets some points deducted for technical foul here. Let's see. Yeah, so the first argument I want to make is that social media position online citizens quite well to call out companies for their misconduct, and in some ways actually even better than traditional news media. And to make this point, I'm going to draw on several studies and some theoretical work I've been doing over the recent years. The second point I want to make is that while we do have large heterogeneity, a lot of noise, rapidly changing moods, flares, many opinions, as Brian mentioned, that makes social media somehow less impactful, there's still a way how these diverse and disconnected users can bundle and become impactful, and probably impact legitimacy, as we argue with our study. And the third point I want to make is that more from a corporate perspective, that probably as a result from this increased pressure on social evaluations, we do see that corporations start to respond to this pressure and change towards a positive way. So we'll argue that organizations are already changing and taking the increased visibility of individual judgments that call them out into account. Right, so my first point and my main point here is that social media and their users are indeed well positioned to call out corporate misconduct and make it visible. The idea of a citizen journalist empowered through social media has been around for a while, so that anyone can make corporate misconduct visible, or at least also criticize organizations almost as a reporter. Let's call these observers online citizens. Here you can see the angry Twitter bird. So this is a regular social media users that can observe organizations, speak out when they feel that organizations violate their very individual values and norms. Now, didn't we have news journalists for that, might you ask? So yeah, well, I would like to argue that actually online citizens on social media complement traditional news media in important ways, and particularly so because journalists and news media might be more hesitant to call corporations out and criticize them. We kind of showed this in a study that we did with my co-authors, Laura Elia, Eleanor Coleoni, Katia Mejerin, and Davide D'Eugenio, and where we looked at judgments of social media users on the one hand and news media on the other about a bank that it was involved in quite some misconduct. And this study is based on manual coding of around 1,500 news articles and automated sentiment analysis of 1.5 million tweets over a period of 1 year. And you can see that the news media tend to endorse, so on average, write positively or at least neutral about this bank, even though involved in quite some misconduct. And then in contrast, the green line, you find that Twitter's users don't really hold back with criticism, right? Clearly in the negative spectrum. So why this is the case? Why this difference? This is where my theoretical work comes in with Davide Ravasi and Eleanor Coleoni. This is an article published in AMR. And here we basically show how social media are different and create reputation differently. And some of the arguments we make is that, not only are there potentially many more reporters on social media that can pick up and make corporate misconduct known, but they also have more freedom to do so. So in contrast, news journalists are constrained in several ways. So how are they constrained? Over recent years, we have seen increased financial pressures on news organization. Investigative journalism is expensive, but also newspapers need to constantly produce content. This makes them much more reliant on and receptible to public relations by firms, which often have the resources, obviously, to build up media relation teams, professionalize their tactics to influence journalists. There's also strong relationships between journalists and leaders of corporations such as CEOs. And to maintain these exclusive access to interesting stories and power holders within corporations, journalists might become more reluctant to report negatively about firms because they might risk damaging these relationships. Furthermore, news organizations as economic entities are under increased financial pressures anyway, and they rely strongly on advertising by corporations, such as banks, car companies. And again, the risk of losing access to this kind of revenue might prevent news media from criticizing firms. And as legal entities, news organizations can probably also be sued, or they have been sued, they have been sometimes sued out of existence. So this makes news media, again, more cautious to call firms out. And also when looking at ownership structures, news media organization, we can see that their structure might have an influence on how and about whom they report. And then finally, if we look at the way journalists work, the journalistic ethos, the professional norms and practices, we see that journalists are keen to report both sides of a story, get also the corporate view on misconduct, have this balanced neutral view. And again, here corporate influence tactics come in. And then also a journalistic style of being proper, neutral in tone, not very emotional, might also render the whole news media reporting less impactful in terms of misconduct. So as a result, stories become more balanced, less daunting, and probably less an issue for firms, as we argue. Now, if you look at social media, that's quite different. So here constraints are obviously much less or even non-existent. In contrast to professionalist news organization, social media users are not professional journalists. They don't have the pressure to constantly produce content and are less receptible to public relations of firms and obviously less directly targeted even by these tactics. Furthermore, online citizens have probably no social connections to firm leaders. They don't rely on exclusive access to organizations. So they don't have the fear of damaging such relationships because they're not really there. Rather, the relationships actually are about similar peers around them. And these kind of relationships might actually motivate them to call organizations out, take a public stand, go after organizations to assure their individual and social identity within the social media network. And then also online citizens do not have really economic relationships. They don't rely on advertising, etc. They might not be sued. We have seen instances where organizations have tried to sue individual social media users, but that typically backfired when, for example, corporations such as Nestle or Samsung tried to go after social media users. They would just, again, make these fear tactics known, which then again would just put them more in a negative light online. Ownership structure also not a problem. Usually the millions of social media users are not owned by anyone really. So there is no dictate to an editorial direction either. And then finally, regular people on social media do not care much about journalistic norms, as you probably all know. They don't care about objectivity and balance. They are free to voice their very one-sided opinion and in very emotional ways. And we know from various studies that this emotionality on social media indeed makes calling out organizations impactful. It increases attention, remembering, becomes contagious, and motivates people to act. Yeah, and this can be clicking on a like button, forwarding a message. As Brian says, this is selectivism, but it can also lead to boycotting and more substantial actions. And for this reason, and this is my first point, I say that social media are well positioned for calling out corporate misconduct and mobilize against a firm that acts unethically and is engaged in corporate misconduct, probably even better than traditional news media. All right, let me come to my second point. You might say now, and also based on Brian's arguments, that these differences might be true, but then again, social media users have less impact because they don't have the reach, they don't have the authority. As well, there might be many different opinions that work against each other, and things might just die out and no one really cares. The fragmentation of the media landscape can diminish the impact of separate conversations, and users don't find each other online, etc. Things die out. And I don't disagree actually with this in principle, but it doesn't mean that disconnected actors and conversations, social media cannot become impactful. And one way how they become impactful is indeed when they're also picked up by traditional news media, or just when they become influence the broader discourse. For example, by being picked up by traditional news media. But of course, this doesn't happen always, and many conversations do die out, as Brian actually said. That's right, many die out, but some do get picked up. So the question for us was then, what are the conditions that define if conversations are picked up by news media or not? And this is a question we looked at with our team again, with Laura Ilya, Eleanor Coleoni, and Katja Majorin. This article was just published in Business and Society. And here we look at the conditions by which the heterogeneity of online evaluations about corporate misconduct converges and how creates this critical mass to influence the broader discourse. That's the media discourse. And again, we looked here at a case of a bank empirically that was involved in a series of scandals. They created some outrage online on Twitter, but not much media attention, didn't influence the media at all. But then we found, while there wasn't really initially an impact, that after a while that we found this tipping point where actually social media discourse impacted the news media discourse. And this happened, as we said, found with when the social media discourse reached refracted attention, which is created when high volume of negative judgments about a firm converge around a few aggregative frames. So we need, on the one hand, this volume, a lot of people talking negatively about the bank, negative judgments, and this might be diverse, but we also need an aggregative frames that basically where these different judgments and conversation converge around. Because as mentioned before, attention is often limited and it's dispersed. So additionally, we need some connection, which is created where social media users co-create content in a hypertextual web, as we call it. And we find that this convergence can reach this tipping point whereby social media start to influence news media discourse and thereby increase the impact by having fewer frames and aggregation towards this tipping point. So based on this empirical study, the point I want to make is, even though social media are subject to large heterogeneity, speed, they can dampen the impact, we also find that negative judgments can become impactful by converging towards a tipping point that increases their reach. So that's my second point, empirically proven. And then the last point I want to make is that the pressure from social media doesn't go unnoticed by firms and has an impact on that, because I hear often the question also from practitioners, what is the actual impact on organizations? But scholars do observe that there are many impacts. It can impact an organizational policy change, replacement of employees that are involved in misconduct, or even industry-wide change of damaging practices. And a nice study by Tubiana and Sitzma, they show how employees whose expectations are violated can trigger a process of what they call emotional escalation on social media, which can lead to the destabilization of organizations, as they show. And the authors show how the shaming and shunning, so these very emotional responses on Facebook, is noticed by the organization, destabilizes the organization in one way, and the organization actually eventually gets rid of their damaging practices and acts again more in favor of their stakeholders. And this is kind of a reactive approach, obviously, to social media pressure. Now, another study I did with my co-authors Itziar Castello and Finn Arup-Nielsen, we find also that corporations become more proactively and start to realize that they can gain an increased understanding of expectations of stakeholders. But not only that, with the study in the pharmaceutical sector, we also see how organizations start to engage with stakeholders in social media to co-create their sustainability agenda. And it was interesting to see in this 4-year study based on ethnography, how social media were increasingly used by the organization to actively engage with stakeholders. And they did so because they became aware, on the one hand, of the risks of being called out if they did something wrong, but also the opportunities to learn from stakeholders and mutually create their sustainability agenda. And we call this the networked legitimacy strategy in our GMS publications, whereby organizations participate in these open platforms of social media, reduce the control over the engagement. So it's not the old way of controlling through PR releases, PR tactics, etc., but rather co-creation. So putting the locus of control outside the organization and engage in more non-hierarchical manner with stakeholders. And through such an approach, as we argue, firms can adopt to the way social media reconfigure the relations between firms and stakeholders. Of course, this is quite a normative way of seeing it, and it remains, of course, also to be seen how firms might apply such more open participatory approaches across the board. Because there might obviously also other practices Brian has noticed. But on the one hand, there is this pressure mentioned previously that might facilitate this change, and also the gains coming from such an approach, as we argue, because organizations can gain legitimacy through that. Now, I think I have a few minutes left. I want to come to my last.
You don't. You're actually out of time, but please do.
All right, sorry. Last point I want to make is, future direction, algorithms. So there's not much attention to algorithms yet. Brian has mentioned it in their study. So definitely look at algorithms, how they filter, rank, and sort information, and how does that impact the relationship between social media misconduct and also the construction of social evaluation in terms of methods, because of the big data that is available and needs to be processed and analyzed. Big data techniques such as sentiment analysis or topic modeling are obviously the way forward. So that's for me. I give over to Rhonda. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And now, let's hear the contingencies until the cows come home from Rhonda.
Right. So how do I stop sharing?
All right. If I can minimize that. Okay, so you can see my screen, I hope?
Yep.
All right, so first I want to thank Mike Burnett for inviting me here. And I found this Rutgers logo and I'm stealing it. Someone's named Rhonda Rieger. This R with the knight, I really like it a lot. So appreciate you inviting me to be here and be part of this debate. It's been really interesting. And I'll try to stay within my time frame. We all want to talk forever because this is such an interesting topic to all of us. But I want to make go back way in history and make a point that, you know, there's really nothing new under the sun. And this is the Gutenberg printing press, which of course was invented quite some time ago in the Middle Ages. And it's the very first book that was printed was the Bible. And this was, you know, to do great good. And obviously printing books has done great good in terms of education and so forth. But within less than 100 years of this printing press, there was a thriving business in pornography in the Middle Ages, because human nature is human nature. And I'll get to social media soon, I promise you. But again, nothing new under the sun. This is Benjamin Franklin publishing under a nom de plume of Silence Dogood, or I think is the name. And he published this newspaper. It was one of the most influential newspapers in the United States at the time of the Revolution, a few years before that. And he knew that he had some opinions that he wanted to get across, that if people knew they were his opinions, they may not take it nearly as seriously. So he often used other people's names, including ones that he made up, and published anonymously. That morphed into yellow journalism and sensationalism, and the press of "we want to make more money" caused to make all kinds of outlandish claims and play very loose with the truth. Not unlike what we see in social media, where we know from work that's been published in Science that the more sensational, the more emotional, the more false, the faster the news travels. And there is a very strong economic incentive to have lots of likes and lots of followers, and to get things retweeted. So it's not surprising at all that people go to these extreme measures on social media and put out false and slanderous kinds of things about companies as well. Now, how did journalism fix that? Well, I was actually at the University of Missouri, where it's the #1 ranked journalism school in the world. Who knew? Where the Code of Ethics for Journalism was actually written. And then this became widely adopted within journalistic circles, and by newspapers, all credible newspapers. There were always sort of mudraker on the edges, fringe newspapers that didn't adhere to this, but in general, there was a code of ethics, and Michael Etter talked quite a bit about some of those things in the Code of Ethics. One of which is that you say who wrote the article, and you disclose that information so that people can investigate and say, do people have a stake in this, or do they have ties to organizations? Because right now in the wild, wild west of the internet, there is no code of ethics. Some of the platforms have loose codes of ethics that they loosely and inconsistently apply. But in general, you're free to post anything that you want, and also under any name. I know this came up in the chat, and David Kirsch, shout out to my former colleague, David Kirsch. I'm so glad you're here. And he was nice enough to send me a pre-print of this article that he's written about fan bots. So you maybe have heard of fanboys. These are fans of a corporation. There's Apple fanboys who go so far as to get the Apple logo tattooed on their chest. And Tesla has many, many fanboys. I guess maybe you can be fangirl also, who are big supporters of theirs. Well, his research takes us a step further and says there are also fan bots, and these are not so benevolent. Just being a fanboy, whether you like the latest boy band or you like the latest technology, is a fairly benign thing, I think. But a fan bot is a bot created by who knows who. And they put out what's called, or what I guess David and his co-author are calling corporate computational propaganda, or CCP. And this CCP, there is, and David maybe can come into the discussion of this. There's software that can turn out whether the person who's putting out a tweet is a human or a bot or not. And I was so happy to hear that David is twice as likely to be a human as Elon Musk is. So that was a good thing to have learned about my good friend David. But these fan bots, it's through the way they write and the times of day that they post. You get a score of, are they likely to be a bot and not a real human? So this is, to me, a really interesting phenomena. And what they found was that they can't say that Tesla was putting these bots out, but suspiciously about the time that they became a publicly traded company with an IPO, a number of these fan bots started operating. And they have operated at key points, positively supporting the company and being a pretty significant volume of tweets that are being put out about the company. And it's very hard to disentangle what is the effect of those tweets versus others. But it's certainly research that we need to be doing much more on. Now, this is potentially the company itself or the fanboys putting these bots out. I don't know who. You'd have to be quite a fan if you didn't have a financial interest in this and you just went to the trouble of creating a fan bot. But, you know, potentially, I like to follow the money, and I'm more likely to think that somebody with a financial interest has created these fan bots and are trying to manipulate the stock in their favor. But I'm always skeptical when money's on the line. Some of you maybe saw this story that just broke 2 days ago by the Washington Post, broke it. Meta, which is Facebook, didn't have to go to the internet. They actually posted many of these in traditional media sites where they paid this right-leaning consulting firm, one that has worked with many right-wing ultra-conservatives, Republicans. And they paid this company to write and then place under bylines of both conservatives and liberals, conservatives and Democrats, to stoke public fears about TikTok. And maybe you remember this. It became an issue for a while, not just on social media, but in real media, that we got to worry about TikTok. It's run by the Chinese and they're going to steal all of our data. And then follow the money, you find out that Meta was actually putting responsible for at least part of that misinformation that was being put out, or if it's not misinformation, they were putting the information out about it. So again, it's nothing new under the sun. This is done in the traditional media as well as in social media, but the traditional media in general has this stance that they're going to check the newsworthiness and the factual basis of everything except their opinion pieces. And that's what these were. These were opinion pieces that the media, pushed by social media, which social media is increasing in use and traditional media is going down. Traditional media is starting to be more emotional, more extreme, giving voices to extreme points of view, not fact checking their opinions, and so forth. So this is kind of a scary thing. Does this social media facilitate this misconduct or not? So I only have about 3 or 4 minutes left, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is, we got to make our own paid commercial here. A paper in AMR with Shenron Wang, who is the first author on this, and Mike Farr and I, where we looked at social disapproval in the social media era. And I really have to credit Joyce. At the time she came to me with this idea, she was a doctoral student, and she really wanted to put in this corporate misinformation piece into this paper. And Mike and I were really skeptical. We were like, oh, firms don't do that. They're going to be found out. It's going to be so embarrassing for them. They'll never do that, yada, yada, yada. Well, it stayed in the paper, and I'm so glad it did, because we're seeing more and more of this. I'm not going to go through, all of this detail. We've already heard all of this about how it's changed everything, but these processes have always happened. What's new is it's faster and it's more emotional and more emotional. I think David Deephouse is on here, and I think he'll back me up on this, means that it's more memorable. And that's a possibility that companies don't necessarily want to see if they're being targeted with this. And also, even if you don't remember it, when you're reminded of it, you might, that emotion will come out in the memory as well. And more communality. When you used to get ticked off at a company, you didn't really have any idea how many other people were also ticked off about them, or how many other bots were ticked off about them. But now you have a better way of figuring that out. So there is a loss of control about that. We've also done a study that's in the review process right now, where we looked at cross-border social disapproval, because we wanted to see, does social media volume in one country where you've done something wrong translate into social disapproval in other countries? And we were really just looking at the volume of Twitter posts and also US blog posts driving this worldwide information spread. And we found, yes, it does. It spills over quickly and is emotionally charged and provides us greater connectivity among constituents worldwide, which I think the jury is still out on, is that a good or a bad thing? Another paper that's in the review process with some colleagues here, all those other people besides me are still at Missouri. I'm now at North Texas. And this is about stock market reactions to social movements. And I just want to show a couple of charts here in response to things that other people have said. If you look at the 0 point, 0 is when a boycott was announced in the press. These echo chambers, I agree with Michael Adder, do not stay in social media, and it's not social media versus traditional media. They echo amongst each other. Our evidence is that a couple of days before the traditional media picks it up, there's a significant increase in Twitter volume, and that continues after and is accelerated after they publish it for a couple of days and stays elevated for a while. Yes, it does, will end pretty quickly, but those days can be not particular happy days, and also can have a significant impact on the stock performance, which I don't have a chart on, but that's what our paper is showing, that they can have an effect. Similarly, the Twitter sentiment, the emotionality does go down well before the media publishes, although the media is reinforcing it. The traditional media is reinforcing what you're seeing on Twitter, and it does then go back up a little bit, but at least in that 10-day window, it doesn't return immediately. So we're only looking at sentiment and volume, and we're only examining words, but we think there's something there that we need to be looking at of what kind of effect is this having. And now that there's bots talking to computer algorithms that are doing trading of stocks, and Wall Street firms are watching what is happening in social media on a minute by minute effect, it's kind of a scary situation of maybe the robots are taking over. I think that I maybe have 30 seconds left or not, but until Mike tells me I've got to shut up, I'm going to talk just a couple more. I think that we need to have this typology of social mediaries, of paid influencers, unpaid influencers, activists, celebrities, trolls, now bots, of who's on social media. And I certainly hope that that a worldwide standard of code of ethics that lets people know what they're getting, because when you get the social media in your feed, you don't know if it's a bot or not, and you don't know if it's a paid influencer or not. So I've had reviewers say, well, you need to tease out who all these various people are to understand who's influential. And I think that's really an important point. But first we need to know, is social media itself being influential? And we're finding out, yes, it is. And I'm not going to go through this because it's already been, both speakers before me talked about this, is that, you know, the traditional media through this process of a code of ethics is much more temperate and unbiased and informative. However, because social media is very partisan and persuasive and is increasing in usage, the traditional media is starting to become more like them. And I don't think that's a good development for the history of knowledge. So I'm going to stop here with this. You know, one of my favorite writers, if you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh. Hopefully I said something made you laugh. Please don't kill me.
All right, thank you so much. And you know, that historical perspective is just very important to keep in mind. I'm always, you know, you see the pictures of everybody on the, you know, subway car looking at their phone, and then that gets demeaned as everybody is overtaken by social media, and then they contrast that with a black and white picture of everybody having a newspaper in front of their face, you know, 50 years prior. So yeah, this stuff still defaults to basic human tendencies, and those aren't really changing with the technology, but there are other ways that it can enable it. So I think those are important contingencies to keep in mind. With that in mind, we go from RR over to CC and ask Craig to give us a practical perspective.
All right. Well, Rhonda, I'm in trouble here because I don't know if I built any jokes into my presentation at all, but I hope there's something that's informative here. So Mike asked for me to prepare something on what's going on in practice. I hope I do that. So the overall question is, does social media facilitate corporate misconduct? I'm going to start with no, but social media do. And one of the first things I want to hopefully add to the discussion here is this idea of thinking about social media as not being monolithic. That there's a lot of forms of social media out there, and this is something, as one of my former journalism professors would nail me on, right? That social media is plural, not singular. I'm also happy, I think, thinking in terms of the other three contributors here, that we haven't seen the argument of focusing on, corporate misconduct in terms of, the good things that companies are doing, and keeping in mind that these are actually two separate continuums. And just because, companies might be performing well ethically on certain dimensions, it does not eliminate the possibility that they could also be performing equally high levels of misconduct. And so, what I want to first of all do is just introduce this idea that when we're thinking about misconduct, that it does need to be kept on a separate continuum from ethical behavior, that companies can be high on both dimensions, they can be low on both dimensions. And if anyone can help me with I would love to, is there a way for me to be able to see everybody at the same time? Am I sharing my screen even?
You were not sharing your screen. I presume that you took the
hey
out of having no PowerPoints, but
basics, right? Okay. Well, you missed my cool slide on the do social media, but I'll start here with this the idea of the corporate misconduct.
We still don't see it. We've got the promise of it now, but it has not been realized.
Promise of it. And we're on a session on technology, and now my computer's freezing up on me, Mike.
Uh-oh. It's the social media. You got some bad bugs from whatever you were doing.
Yeah. Man, this is crazy. My computer's freezing up on me.
All right. Well, we still got you here, so it hasn't crashed, at least the Zoom.
Hey, can you see it now? The slide now?
There we go. Yep.
Excellent. Okay, cool. Well, sometimes just patience. Okay. I'll continue with the idea of social media are not monolithic. So we can actually think of a variety of platforms, and thinking of it from an in-practice perspective, and also as someone with a scholarly background, a lot of the research I'm seeing is only focusing on certain platforms that are out there. So one of the ideas that I want to keep in mind here is that we as scholars are also shaped by media and the problems that we're undertaking and how we think about corporate misconduct, how we think about social media is shaped by our own media environment. And I'm not sure that we can really step out of it, but I think there is something for simply being aware of the possibility that we are largely still being shaped by these media forces out there. So that's a seed I want to plant as I go through it. Another idea that I'd like to introduce is when we're thinking about corporate misconduct in our research here, that I think we need to move beyond thinking about stakeholders when we're looking at assessing corporate misconduct. So the term that I use for this is campus networks. Okay, and there's two goals. Number one is to expand beyond our thinking of the people that we're engaging with as stakeholders to realize that there's a lot of other ways and frames and ways that we experience others and interact with others. The idea of constituents, whether we're thinking about investors or we're thinking about it from a political sense, is they're defined by the vote, and companies are involved in a number of activities that in terms of their misconduct can be analyzed in terms of the efforts that they undertake to shape public opinion or voting or when decisions are being made. And so that's a key difference with stakeholders, because you think about stakeholders having ongoing relationships on a day-to-day basis, but part of this idea of constituents is the movement that goes forward to where decisions are made, and then once a decision is made, it's locked in place for a year. Key to the discussion also is thinking about the idea of stakeholders as audiences who are defined by media channels. And this is key for for business research, because if we're thinking about organizations attempting to reach their consumers or their stakeholders through media, if you don't know the rules of the channel, if you don't know the rules of the media, you can actually do substantial harm, reputational and relational, even legitimationally, through media, because you're not aware of the norms and the rules. For example, the rules that Michael has here on our forum for today's debate. Publics is another way of thinking about stakeholders, and it's more important now in the digital environment. And that's simply our ability to think about how Googleable we are. And for me, the issue is also the effort that's undertaken by companies to keep certain things that they're concerned with ungoogleable, right? One of the key issues here is thinking about how what we're aware of is by what we're able to search for and find. And if things don't have words for them yet, it allows technologists, companies to be ahead of the law, to be ahead of our language. Users has certainly come into play with more with technology, and stakeholders, I think, is what brings this crowd together. So the key idea here is that thinking about how emerging technologies are outpacing the law, but also how emerging technologies are outpacing our theories and our scholarship. And for me, that's become a fascination in the past few years. So right now, I didn't share this in the intro, so I'm teaching a CSR course there at Rice, but most of my time is actually involved in ethnographic work in not just corporate America, but with companies overseas with some of the issues that are going on with Russia and Ukraine. I hope some of that will come out in the discussion here later. Another thing, and I think I want to back up and start with one of Rhonda's future directions, where she talked about the research focusing on words and on visibility and on tone. And David Deephouse, who's also here on our call today, he and I have developed a framework where we look at different types of content that are emerging. And I really want to focus more on the later ones, on the ties and the timing. The classic one is volume, but that volume is the one that shapes our awareness more than anything else. One complication I want to introduce with tone is that right now, most of the research is simply focusing on positive, negative, neutral, or mixed. And some of the research I have with Rod Hart at the University of Texas is that we could actually complicate tone in a variety of different ways. For positive content, we can think about praise, inspiration, and satisfaction. For negative content, we can think about blame, denial, and hardship. And the reason why this is important is that when we unpack tone in ways differently than positive, negative, what we can discover is that they have different antecedents and different consequences. For example, satisfaction as a type of positive content actually leads to the stalling or the diminishing of proactive behavior, but inspiration leads to its continuation. So in organizational context, thinking about how we separate inspiration and praise from satisfaction and the long-term consequences as we study behavior unfolding. And then the last two, ties and timing, I would love to see other people get those onto the table. A perfect example of a tie was from a classic study by Barry Stahl in 2001, 2002 of ASQ, who was looking at the link between reputation and innovation. And what he discovered by linking corporate reputation research or the media coverage with the co-occurrence of the company name with innovation led to a higher reputation for innovation. So it's the co-occurring of the company name with the attribute, where when we think about topics, it's usually the topic in the context of a company. So the difference is it sounds subtle, but the implications of separating a topic in the context of a company versus a topic co-occurring with the idea and looking at that co-occurrence together. That's my social media talk, or my Apple Watch talking to me right there. So another media application. So some new areas that I would like to see us think about as we're exploring social media are the metaverse, where we think about augmented reality versus virtual reality, mediated reality versus XR. And one of the new terms is diminished reality, which is the capacity for wearing the special glasses where we can actually cancel out and block objects from vision. Now, one of the reasons why I'm sharing some of this is that some of the work that I'm doing now is focused on what is not being published and if everything that we're focusing on in terms of corporate scandal or corporate misconduct is focused on awareness, then we're missing other ways of looking at the linkages. I saw this in the chat, and I can't see the chat right now, but this idea of linking social media to new organizational forms, so we can think about one to few networks. And this is, I think, a challenging area for our research, is to think about these new forms of media. One is the idea of newsletters and how we study subscription-based services where audiences or companies are able to engage their audiences, not necessarily off the record, but outside of public view. And how we do this, how we gain access to these archives of newsletters is going to be a challenge. I think when my model, when my computer froze, I skipped over this part here. Going back to Rhonda's observation about the content and the focus on volume and tone, I also want to add the idea that we could think from a higher level when we're thinking about the relationship between social media and misconduct. So far, we've mostly focused on content, what's measurable through our analysis of Twitter, through our analysis of Facebook comments. And I think we could actually begin looking at higher levels of analysis, right? Not just the individual contributors of media content, but start thinking in terms of higher levels of analysis, the routines that are at play in terms of content production, and also think about the role that censorship plays. I like the example that was given about the corporate computational bots, fan bots, and how companies are starting to shape their content there. We could think at a higher level about external to the organization. So the company level, we can think about Facebook or Twitter or some of the other media organizations that are out there. but the higher level, Michael, I think everyone, Michael and Brian and I can't see everyone on Rhonda, we're all looking at the public relations aspect here. Okay, so I think that's certainly important that we begin thinking about these higher levels of influence. And then we're also seeing, certainly now, I think China's already been mentioned, but we're also facing this now with what's going on with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how that's affecting the media environment. Somebody mentioned in the chat that certain countries do not have access to certain types of social media. And we can think about our own preferences for certain media channels here versus the media channels that are present in China and Russia, which may not have to our disposal because of our limited language. Mike, it looks like I'm freezing up again.
All right. Oh,
There we go. Super. I also want to introduce the idea that we need to begin moving beyond Twitter and Facebook for our content, and YouTube to begin thinking about some of the other social media platforms as we move into what is being called Web 3.0, right? The AR cloud. We could think about smart helmets and holograms and holographic data storage, spatial audio and spatial display, some new technologies that are starting to emerge. The question of synthetic social media for personalization and in the workplace, and the impact that it's having here. So 3 good examples here are the degree of sexual harassment that's going on in the virtual world, where it's occurring through avatars, or the role that it's playing on truth decay. And I think we had already heard mentioned today the idea that we could uncover deep fakes. Right? Another area, this is tying into Michael's presentation here about how citizens might have a few more freedoms than what journalists have. But I think it's worth looking at the degree that some of our social media influencers are actually subject to other forms of harassment and doxing that we're not aware of, right? So there's a whole lot of work here in this idea of social media, social intermediaries that Ron had mentioned, that is going to open up all types of other doors. My comments, more time.
That's it. You guys hear that little ding that I put in there?
Very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll stop there.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I mean, in the same way that Rhonda's look at history was fascinating for what that means for now. I mean, you're looking ahead as well and reminding us that not only are social media plural, but they're also getting more complicated than just Twitter or something like that. Yes. Unless you want us to see all this going on. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Thank you.
So yeah. Then even the metaverse and trying to be much more involved than just sharing words. But yeah. So in the remaining time, what I'd like to do is give everybody on the panel a chance to now react to what they've heard, and hopefully sum up with at least one very specific research question that, if you get that next email from an editor to review a paper, what do you want that paper to actually be asking? Because hopefully then some folks in the audience now, or when they view this later, will take you up on that offer and actually engage in that research. But we'll start with, and in the meantime, folks in the audience here, please put up your hand, use that function on Zoom, or find some other way to indicate that you have a question. We'll get to that thereafter. But let's start then with Brian.
Okay, thanks. Wow, everybody's presentation was really interesting, and I think I just don't see us as being in a real disagreement here. I think everybody can point to cases where, in fact, social media has been used to curb corporate misconduct, and in other cases where it doesn't seem to be working. And the question is when and where and how can social media be effective in curbing this misconduct? And I think that's the issue that really needs to be addressed now. And I think, I mean, Michael's paper that he mentioned, looking at the Business and Society paper, I mean, it was very well done, very interesting. And I think it's the right way to go. And he's essentially saying, okay, under these, you know, if you get to a certain threshold of refracted attention, you'll get an impact on news media. And that's really interesting. The thing about his paper, though, is that if I remember correctly, something like 7% of the hashtags achieve that threshold. So that, you know, so the question is, how do you achieve that threshold so that, you know, the social media will have an impact? So I guess that's to me, that's the big question that's out there. How can this social media be used to achieve an impact so as to get news media attention and then for some impact on corporate misconduct. So
yeah, so still some of the process questions on the how side. I thought you were going to go with the, you know, basically the when as well. So when can social media or a particular form of social medium be effective in curbing corporate misconduct, but getting much more into the specifics there. But turn it over to Michael.
Sure, thank you very much. Very interesting presentations. And yeah, as Brian said, it's probably not a black and white thing. There's many gray areas, and good for us, many future studies. And also what I took away very strongly from Rhonda's and also Craig's presentation is how the technology is evolving, regulation is evolving, knowledge is evolving. So it's a constantly changing field. When I started working on the topic 10 years ago, it was completely different than today. And luckily, some of the studies still work nicely and some of the theoretical arguments, but yet obviously need to be constantly revised. And studying it is difficult with bots, not understanding really how algorithms work, etc. So there's a lot of challenges in terms of methodology as well. And there were some good comments in the chat about, you know, how can you account for bots, etc. But yeah, I see also methodologically we're getting there. So definitely an interesting field. My question would go towards, yeah, the role of, in terms of changing technologies, the role of algorithms, that's what I'm personally interested in, but then obviously things like fake news, how relevant and impactful this is really. There's really a debate in journalism that basically says all this misinformation attention, misinformation is not that impactful. People are more savvy than we think. They can identify it, and others are saying that's not the case. The same goes for actually the argument of filter bubbles. In journalism, political studies, there's a big debate. Do these actually exist, filter bubbles, or is this, you know, and there's no conclusive results as far as I understand from looking at the journalism discipline and political studies. So yeah, evolving field, lots to discover, and looking forward to that.
With that in mind, though, Michael, do you think there's anything that has been firmly decided that we probably don't need to further investigate in this area?
That's a good question. Is there? You put me on the spot here. I cannot think of something now. I'll come back if something rings. Yeah. Okay,
I'm sure Rhonda knows, right, Rhonda?
Nothing is ever finally decided.
Yeah, but there's some stuff you just don't want to hear any more about, you know?
Well, my colleague David Kirsch is on my screen right below me, and I'm sure he'd say there's medieval people who historians who are still arguing about the effect of the Gutenberg press. So nothing is ever finally decided. So one of the things that I find positive is that when I first told people I was studying social media and tweets and all that, they thought the modal answer was, well, that's frivolous, and why are you bothering to do that? And I think we're past that. I think people are realizing that social media is having real effects on the traditional media. It's having real effects on individuals. I don't know, maybe the people in England and the UK, Michael, Eder, are more savvy than Americans, but I can tell you the misinformation and things that people tell me with a straight face here in the United States, and I'm like, wait, did you take science class? And then they found, I find out that they heard about it on the internet. So I think this misinformation is not just negatively impacting firms, which is, what I most care about in my academic life, but this misinformation is affecting the Ukrainian people and what's happening there, and it's affecting science and progress in society on all kinds of levels. So I think one of the things that we can help shed light on is how do we get past this, what I would call the post-truth era, where we can kind of get back to there's some generally accepted standards of truth, and that you have to pass those generally accepted standards before you're allowed to shout from the rooftops and or through Twitter, whatever else your megaphone is. Because I think we're, on my worst days, I think, oh my gosh, we're heading back into the dark ages where there are no signs of what is truth or not. And this is not a good place to be as a society. So I managed to work in both something silly and apocalyptic into my comments. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, especially on April Fool's Day, it feels awkward to not have a sense of objective reality, but I think that's probably a bit of what we're in nowadays. A question popped up in the meantime, so I'm going to kind of feed that in as Craig gives his answer too. But, I remember the early days of this stuff when people were getting, big NSF grants and all kind of attention, media exposure. If you could get 10 million data points off Facebook or whatever, and it just became kind of the sexy source of data, whether or not the questions that they asked were really tied to anything that could be best answered that way. Sort of like, we've had a big push for a while of shoving executives into MRI machines and saying that, ooh, look what the cool stuff when their patterns light up, but we don't know what the hell that really means. So the question comes up of, are we crowding out other better ways or technologies that are of importance to dealing with social misconduct when we think about this? But as Craig was pushing us out into the metaverse and all that, I'll push this over onto him.
Okay, sure. For me, I think one of the key ideas here that I'd like to leave with everyone is to recognize that we ourselves as scholars are still shaped by our media environment, and always to challenge ourselves to be aware of, to the degree that we ourselves are living in filter bubbles. My background, my doctoral work was at UT Austin in a multidisciplinary, not just journalism, but business and public policy is one of my disciplines there. And the project that I worked on was combining reputational data that came from Farnborn when he was at NYU with LexisNexis, using a big data approach to their database, getting a grant from LexisNexis, and having the opportunity to work with them behind the scenes and their computational linguists on the design of keywords that are now being used to monitor corporate reputation. I began to see that there's so much going on here by not understanding the forces behind the production of media content. So the idea I'd like to leave with everyone is recognizing, I think we all know that content's not neutral, but content is more than just simply the volume of tweets or the tone of tweets. The example that I gave with my work with Deep House to show that there's multiple levels of influence on the production of content. And there's also a variety of ways of thinking of new dimensions. So some of Michael's work in social media using Twitter and some of his work on algorithms is a great way of showing the linking of data there, and some of his work on legitimacy. And so that's certainly, I think, going to be a whole new paradigm for us to be thinking about this, applying network theory to the work that we're doing in this space. But we can also think about this idea of sequencing, right? So if we think about two headlines, dog bites man does not mean the same thing as man bites dog, right? I mean, which one of those is more likely to get covered in the press? But sometimes the way we set up our big data analysis, we're not able to unpack the degree that sequence salience in itself can create key messages and create key ideas that can be analyzed in particular ways. So in conclusion, just kind of one, being aware that we are, shaped by more by our media environment than what we're recognizing, that we need to move beyond just simply volume and tone, and our analysis of media content. And then third, I think we need to combine our work with ethnographic work. There's so much that's going on for companies to keep things out of the press. And given our current focus on transparency and accountability right now, there's a certain, and this is the cynical side that's coming up, but it's also coming out of my research. Companies are playing into this idea by signaling transparency, signaling accountability. And the reason is the more that the public perceives them to be accountable, the more that the public perceives them to be transparent, the more likely the public is to leave them alone and let them allow to return back to the awful, evil things that they were doing that the media are not drawing attention to.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about, all this. We arguably have almost infinite transparency, but in some ways that has created more of a cloud. So how all that plays out is some of what Brian, Irene, and I explored in the paper that Brian first discussed. But well, we've hit 1 o'clock, so I'm going to end this formally, but invite everybody to stick around after we end the recording to give honest answers, not this bullshit you've been talking already. Right? And then we'll see who wants to stick around for that. Feel no obligation, but we'll clear out the bots and get moving along. So a sincere thanks to the panelists for a great debate. Many thanks to all of you for participating. The materials from today's session will soon be posted on the RIXI website whenever my dogs shut up. And that RIXI website is at ricsi.business.rutgers.edu. Please join us for the next and final quasi seminar on May 13th, when we'll debate the question, should companies reduce income inequality? That session will feature Georges Enderle, Rashi Agrawal, Amitava Dutt, and John Allison. So I hope to see you there. Thank you very much. All right, Deb.